Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Oops, that's a bit too loud. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Fanar Haddad. I am a senior research fellow here at the MEI. Welcome to you all. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Gerd Nonnemann. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Close enough.
Close enough. Professor Nonnemann is a professor of international relations and Gulf studies at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service in Qatar, where he served as dean from 2011 till 2016. He holds a PhD in politics from the University of Exeter. Prior to his appointment as dean of SFSQ, he served as professor of international relations and Middle East politics and Al-Qasimi professor of Gulf studies at the University of Exeter, where he also directed the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies and also the Center for Gulf Studies. A former executive director of BRISMAS, he is joint editor of the Journal of Arabian Studies, and he has published widely on matters relating to politics in the Gulf. So without further ado, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And as I've already told Fanar, it's really nice to be back here, not just back here, but back here in MEI in its new premises, which are very impressive. But it's always a pleasure to be in Singapore, in any case, for all sorts of reasons, both for friends and just enjoying the food. What I thought I'd do today is not so much to talk specific about the details of the Qatar crisis, although I'm very happy to talk about that in the Q&A, the discussion, any aspects you may find interesting. But what I thought I would do was to reflect a little bit on what has changed and what hasn't changed in the foreign policy environment, in the foreign policy patterns of the Gulf. I suppose one would have said of the GCC. These days, it makes more sense to avoid that term because it's become an empty shell. But let's say the states that are part of the GCC, the Gulf monarchies. So, what is the Qatar crisis and the boycott and what's come after it? What does that tell us about what's different and what's remained the same, and what are the implications of that for regional politics? So I'll approach it sort of roughly speaking from a foreign policy analysis perspective and look at the kinds of things that people who do analyze foreign policy usually look at. So before the crisis, before 2017, of course, there's long been diversity and conflict and reconciliation among these states. But it would appear that something has changed. So let's go back to the period before that crisis. There was a little bit of a foretaste for the boycott episode back in 2013-14, when the three Gulf states that are involved in this boycott withdrew their ambassadors. At least that's what it was called, although in one case there was no ambassador to start with. But nevertheless, there was that upswing in tension, and then eventually it subsided and it was settled, only to re-erupt in 2017. So if we look back to the long history, the longue durée, as it's sometimes called, of foreign policy behavior among these states, then there are 5 things I'd like to outline first. I'm basically sketching out a few things here, and I hope we can then discuss this in more detail further. The first is that the broad nature of foreign policy patterns of these monarchical states of the Gulf have always included 2 things. One, the prioritization in their foreign policy of regime or dynastic or faction security and the security of the state. So that was the absolute priority underpinning much of foreign policy. The second was to lock in a security guarantor superpower of sorts, a major power, and then cultivate complementary relationships at the same time, so that the major protector couldn't take you for granted, and that nobody could accuse you of being in the pocket of that major protector, and at the same time, none of these others could threaten your independence or your security because you had that major protector. So these states, by and large, for well over a century, I would suggest, have followed this combined policy, maintaining or trying to maintain their autonomy both at the regional and at the global levels. That goes a little bit against, as a parenthesis, that goes a little bit against the assumption that many people have had, also in the IR literature, that little states, really don't have much choice. Everything's determined in Washington and London, and if you're in the periphery, you better dance to the tune that is played by these major powers. In fact, my argument is that that's never been the case. It's never been as straightforward as that. These small states have always potentially had a fair bit of room for maneuver, and some have exploited this better than others, and I would suggest that the Gulf states, the marketable Gulf states, have been among the better players of that game. So that's the first thing to note. The second is the threat perception. So what have been the perceptions in these states of their threat environment? Because of course that's going to inform your foreign policy. There are three levels of threats, or three types of threats. Strategic, the one that one normally talks about, ideological, and status threats, I would add. That's to say, if you care particularly about your status in a particular region, then anything that threatens that status, or that you think threatens that status, is also a threat. And the main sources of those three types of threats, the main country sources have obviously been Iran and Iraq over decades, many decades. Both strategically, because they were two of the big beasts in that region. They were militarily strong, and at various times there were ideological threats emanating from these places. From Iraq, of course, socialism, Baathism, Arab nationalism. From Iran, since 1979, the Islamic Revolution. But there is another country threat, or source of threat in the region, at least for 5 of these states, the 5 smaller ones. And that source, of course, is Saudi Arabia. That's always been a major part of the threat environment for the 5 small ones. Okay, so that was the situation. That's always been the situation up until the moment of this more recent set of events. The third of my 5 points under the situation prior to the crisis is about the wider international environment. Again, any foreign policy analysis of any country, you look at the domestic situation, you look at the regional environment, and at the global environment. So one of the things that stands out is that until fairly recently, the international environment was fairly predictable. It was fairly settled. In that international environment, the role of the US was pretty clear, at least since the Second World War. If we go back further, you've got to think about the role of Britain, and even before that, it was the Ottomans. And incidentally, in these different periods, whether it was when the Ottomans were still paramount, or whether it was during the British Empire, the British role in the Gulf, or subsequently the American hegemonic role, the earlier pattern I pointed to applied. So the local players, the sheikhs, and the leaders also of the Al Saud, would recognize the situation, and by and large they'd identify that major hegemon. They would try and pull them close, and then at the same time develop all these complementary relationships, so that the hegemon wouldn't run away with the idea that he could just make you jump, and you'd just say, how high? So back to the situation, the international environment until fairly recently was settled and predictable, with the role of the US and assumptions locally about the US role as an effective protector for which there was no alternative. That was pretty generally assumed. The fourth point is about the decision makers and the decision-making structures through which these perceptions are filtered and then translated into actual policy. We can't go into too much detail here, obviously, but it's essentially, it's a prism, and it's an an interpretive and executing mechanism, right? As I said, this means both the system as a whole, the foreign policy bureaucracy, however you might define that, the governing bureaucracy, and it means the individuals involved, particular leaders, what goes on in the mind of a leader. A few examples, and so then with it, with that come role conceptions. That's another term from foreign policy analysis. In other words, what's the conception of that country or of that leadership of their role in the region and in the world, of their country's role and position and of their own role and position in the world? What's their conception of that? And usually such a role conception is not something that changes from day to day. That these have long-term character. So for instance, the Al Saud and the Al Saud leadership have always had, part of their role conception has always been that they are the dominant player, and ought to be the dominant player on the Arabian Peninsula, without question. And so that's just one element. Abu Dhabi, in a recent decades, or maybe the last 15, 20 years, has also developed its own particular role conception, increasingly seeing itself as a sort of secondary superpower in the region. Qatar, arguably, has acquired a different role conception ever since the consolidation of power of Sheikh Hamad, even before he took power in 95. But really from the early 90s, it was obvious that the Qatar leadership saw itself increasingly as no longer able to be satisfied with the status of sort of a dependency, effectively, of Saudi Arabia. And increasingly, as they acquired the means of and the wealth of a fast developing state and a big player in the global energy scene, with that came a commensurate conception of the role that a place like Qatar should play in the region and in the globe. So these are kind of longer term features. The fifth point and final point I want to make about the situation as it was before this crisis erupted is about the GCC. So the GCC as an organization, the Gulf Cooperation Council as an organization, and I think is, of course, in part, it was a tool in order to achieve certain aims or to move towards certain ambitions, but it's also an illustration. It's an illustration of the fact that the way in which the external environment and the threats that I've talked about are perceived, interpreted, and acted upon by these individual rulers or state leaderships has differed, and there are two things stand out. Among the conservative states of the Gulf, they superficially look very similar, but actually there's always been great diversity in location, in interest, in capabilities, in interpretation. So and there's been lots of clashes between them, not just divergence, but clashes, even armed clashes, between Qatar and Abu Dhabi. It's been between, you name it, they've virtually all had conflicts with each other. But the common threat perception and a common reaction to it only seems to emerge at times of peak threat. And the creation of the GCC was one example of that. And then once the GCC was created, it functioned by and large, I'm simplifying, of course you can always pick holes in that, but it functioned by and large in the same kind of way. In other words, it would be effective, at least as a kind of strategic collaboration or cooperation organization, really only at times when there was peak threat. And whenever that sense of peak threat dissipated, the effectiveness of the organization in terms of external diplomacy and strategic initiatives would wither. Of course, that was not the only aim or the only use for the organization. There was also the idea that the GCC could help coordinate development, and it could standardize certain ways of working. They could evolve towards a customs union, which would be useful for economic development. You could have free movement of persons. You could have investment across borders. All of these things, of course, are also useful. And it's those very practical issues, although not quite as advanced as initially hoped for. It's really in those areas that the GCC has been a success. But the third area where I think the GCC has been useful, and I think that's often been overlooked, is that it served as a tool, some people might say slightly cynically, as a tool for the different leaderships to send out different messages to different audiences while maintaining a separate bilateral policy stance. So in many cases, it might make perfect sense for a country, for a state, to adopt a particular bilateral policy towards country X or Y or Z, while at the same time sending different messages to other regional or global audiences. And for that purpose, those messages could be sent through the GCC, and that's often been the case. So it's not been a completely useless organization by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, so just to say again, these moments of peak threat, which explain both the creation of the GCC and its occasional coming together as a strategic actor, illustrations or examples of that were the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, the Iran-Iraq war, when the fear was that Iran might, and so subsequent to the Iranian Revolution, that Iran might become an existential threat, and so on. Afterwards, the question is, so for instance, in more recent days, strands of jihadism around the region, could they constitute a similar kind of perceived peak threat? I think I'll suggest probably not. I mean, some capitals have interpreted it as the kind of threat that everybody ought to get together about. Others, perhaps less so. Okay, so as I said, there's always been divisions, and different capitals, different leaderships have perceived the threat environment differently, very often. One particular example of that is, I've already referred to. It is the way in which the smaller fry, the smaller states see Saudi Arabia, right? So that was always an underlying tension in the way the GCC operated and was used or not used. It's kind of almost a fundamental contradiction, because the feeling in the smaller states, one might partially accept Bahrain from this, which has become so utterly dependent in every way on Saudi Arabia that it really hasn't got any chance, or at least the leadership has decided they haven't got any alternative but to go along. But everywhere else, the fear has been that the GCC was only used by or was intended by Saudi Arabia to dominate the others. Okay, so the results of that picture, as I sort of referred to it a number of times, but let's quickly sum it up. There was a persistence of bilateral conflicts and tensions and divergence among these countries for the longest time. There was a pattern of using regional institutions, and first and foremost the GCC, where it could be useful, and against short, acute threats. And there was an ability, or there was a pattern, that one, or at least a regular occurrence of using the GCC to send multiple messages to multiple audiences. Now, so in other words, conflict in the Gulf amongst these monarchical states is not unusual, is not new. But even during times of conflict, and throughout that whole long period up to, say, 2017, really, there were always channels of communication that were safeguarded, even when there were minor armed clashes. Conventions of what you might call sheikhly exchange. How do the leading sheikhs behave towards each other? How do they relate to each other? Certain conventions about what's acceptable behavior and not. How to save face, how to allow others to save face. Respect for kinship networks, whether among the ruling families or more broadly. And an awareness of the common interest of these ruling kinship groups. So there was all of those things I'm suggesting were always there and were always safeguarded throughout moments of crisis or dissension. So now, where are we now? What's remained the same and what's changed? If we look at the wider environment, first of all, well, you might say that the obvious thing to say is, oh, well, the United States is no longer quite so undisputed a hegemon, right? Or at least that's the perception within the region. Or at least there are fears among players within the region that the US is no longer quite the reliable security guarantor that it once was. In fact, I don't know if you heard about Professor Bertrand Badi, French international relations scholar. He said we're at the end of global power politics. He's puts it quite starkly. But certainly, I suppose it can be argued, even if it's largely a matter of perception in Gulf capitals, and not just in the Gulf, that it itself creates its own reality. So that certainly the perception is that that one can rely relatively less on the US as a security guarantor, that there are alternative players, or at least complementary players, beginning to emerge in the global arena, not least China and Russia, and who knows, India coming along in the future, and that therefore there is both a need and a possibility for smaller players within these different regions, including in the Gulf, to carve out some of their own agency, to fill in the vacuum, supposedly. That is one change. Another environmental change has, of course, been the Arab Spring. Right? The Arab Spring has informed the threat environment, the perception of the threat environment of all governments in the region, although not all of them have interpreted it in the same way. Now, I'll say, first of all, the Arab, I will immediately put a rider to this. It's true that the Arab Spring has taken a lot of attention and has been, people have written whole libraries already in the few years since it's happened about it, and it created a lot of fear and anxiety, as well as the initial exhilaration in the region. But I don't think you can say this is unprecedented. So if we look at the foreign policy patterns over the long durée of the Gulf states, things like the Arab Spring, serious ideological threats are not, and upheavals are not unprecedented. After all, there's been several revolutions over the decades in the region. So it's not completely unprecedented. So that's about the global and the regional environment. So threats within that, the threats, to what extent are they different from the ones that I enumerated earlier? The strategic, status, and ideological threats emanating chiefly from Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Well, in many ways, they're still the same. Substantively, they're still the same. Although, of course, Iraq is no longer an ideological threat, but it's still potentially in the future it's going to be a strategic threat, and it's a threat in another way of the threat of state collapse or state incapacity, and the possibility that allows for non-state actors, violent non-state actors, to start messing around with other states' security. But clearly, one continuing theme, continuing threat, at least for the 5 smaller states, is Saudi Arabia. That hasn't changed at all. In fact, it's probably worsened. The third comparison to look at is the role conceptions. So what's changed in role conceptions, or what's remained the same? For Saudi Arabia, it's largely remained the same, except it's been reinforced. Its sense of itself and its position in the region has only been reinforced. Abu Dhabi's sense of being the other little superpower in the region has also clearly been reinforced. And it's gone hand in hand with a material building up of its ability, of its military capability. Qatar's role conception had of course, strengthened or changed over the previous 20-odd years or so. Although around the time of, so it's around 2013, by around 2013, it was already beginning to revise some of its more ambitious goals. Okay. The interpretation of all this varied between the different actors. The interpretation of the threat from Iran, the interpretation of the threat from Islamism, for instance, differed quite substantially between different players in the Gulf. The Omanis, for instance, the Qataris, clearly saw Iran potentially problematic, not necessarily to be trusted, but not an existential threat. A threat that could be managed or lived with. And indeed, a problematic major power that wasn't going to go anywhere and had to be lived with, right, for economic and security reasons. Whereas clearly in Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi, that was not the attitude. I already said the Saudi threat as for the smaller fry in the region, except for Bahrain, is now newly consolidated as quite as bad as they had all feared. All right, so the picture we get then, or this divergence in interpretation of these threats, based in part on differing role conceptions that are emerging, or strengthened role conceptions, are part of the reason for the emergence of the conflict between Qatar and the Quartet, including up to 2014. But until the boycott was imposed, the earlier pattern that I also referred to, that goes back for more than a century, of maintaining these bridges, these channels of communications, observing the honor code almost, and the social codes and social fabric and networks, whether in broader society or amongst the ruling elites, that was still maintained. So, to put it a different way, conflict among the conservative states of the Gulf is not new. But something else is, and we can talk about the details of the boycott and so on, but clearly some of these older, longer standing patterns or principles of how you relate to conflict, how you manage conflict, how you circumvent conflict, how you keep ladders in the cupboard for others to climb down eventually, and so on, without disrupting the social fabric that, if anything, has been strengthened across the Gulf because of the creation of the GCC. That is new, right? The fact that all of that seemed to have been dismissed when the boycott was imposed. So what explains this? To an extent you could say, well, it's perhaps some of those diverging and strengthening role conceptions in places like Riyadh and Abu Dhabi and Qatar. But something else certainly also changed. I've already suggested that along with the changing role conception in Abu Dhabi, there was actually a material change in its military capabilities. It's not only the leading, Mohammed bin Zayed especially, who grew up all his life with the army and the security forces and so on. That's completely the life that he's been immersed in forever. And through which, this prism through which he sees a lot of Abu Dhabi's interests, the UAE's interests, and the region. Always had an idea that the military and the security forces are going to be important. But what's happened, of course, is by now, not only has he become a lot more confident, a number of years since Sheikh Zayed passed away, but the military capacity of Abu Dhabi and the UAE has indeed become very significant. So that's a kind of material change that goes hand in hand with the role conception. But I think crucially, the crucial change really beyond that is the change in decision-making structures. Particularly in two places where theoretically, we always think about these states as being led by strongmen, by individuals, by emirs, by kings. Whereas actually very often it's a little bit more diverse than that. And the two places where theoretically there's always more room for maneuver, more room for different voices being part of the policymaking establishment, those two places, of course, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And I think that crucially in those two places, a change has happened. In Saudi Arabia, foreign policy, like other parts of policy, were always subject to this huge beast of the Al Saud, this massive clan, thousands and thousands of princes. And even if you just look at the most important ones, the most senior ones, it's still a large group. And they traditionally, they always have had, or they always had, until very, very recently, sort of particular briefs. Different princes would have particular briefs, particular portfolios. And when it came to certain complex issues, there would be a lot of debate and toing and froing and trying to come to some kind of consensus and so on. So policy making very often, also in foreign policy, was very often very slow and not always very clear. But by the same token, you wouldn't have radical departures very suddenly. So clearly what's changed in Saudi Arabia is that that system has effectively been swept aside. Now you have one real wielder of power, Mohammed bin Salman, covered by the presence, the still surviving presence of his father, King Salman, because one of the surviving patterns of politics in Saudi Arabia is that one doesn't go against the king. So that gives the security to Mohammed bin Salman that he needs for his revolutionary changes that he's been pushing through, including in foreign policy. And essentially in Saudi Arabia, foreign policy decisions are now made by Mohammed bin Salman and his very small group of courtiers around him. Nobody else feeds into that. And that's a massive change in Saudi Arabia. So the other change is, of course, in UAE. And it goes hand in hand, not just with the self-image and the role conception of Abu Dhabi and its leadership, particularly Mohammed bin Zayed, but with the financial crisis, the circumstance of the financial crisis that occurred, of course, globally, but also affected Dubai in particular, because Dubai was virtually bankrupted as a result of overextending, over-leveraging its financial capabilities, and ultimately had to be bailed out by Abu Dhabi to the tune of about $20 billion. And that's really changed the nature of decision-making of the UAE as a state, the foreign policy decision-making of the UAE as a state. Because the UAE had its own diversity. That's United Arab Emirates. It's 7 sovereign emirates, in theory, right? Dubai had long, in fact, until fairly recently, had its own armed force, did its own procurement, arms procurement, etc. And of course, by virtue of its economic success and its brand regionally and internationally, it packed a punch, and including in foreign policy. So very often, Dubai might well subscribe to notionally UAE or federation policies regionally and internationally, but pursue its own, follow its own group, right? Because it served Dubai's interests. With the financial crisis and the impact that that had for Dubai's dependence on Abu Dhabi, that's also come to a virtual end. Think about some of the accusations that the UAE or the Quartet has hurled at Qatar of being close to Iran. Well, the biggest trader with Iran is the UAE, and that's because of Dubai. And there's hundreds of thousands of Iranians who either still being as citizens of Iran or as by now Dubai or part of Dubai who live and work there. So Dubai always had different interests and was able to pursue them even while they might notionally adopt policies that said something else. Now that autonomy has been much constrained, and certainly in terms of the foreign policy, certainly in terms of feeding into decisions like imposing the boycott on Qatar, that's been very evident. So I think those major changes in decision-making about in who makes decisions and how decisions are made in foreign policy especially are a critical part of the explanation for what's happened here, for the for the boycott. Okay, so what does that mean in terms of some of the international relations and regional relations implications? Again, I'm not going to talk about the boycott itself or the implications on Qatar or who can sustain what for how long. We can discuss this afterwards if you like. I'm very happy to do that. First of all, has there been a structural change in the international relations of the Gulf? What's happened to this role, the traditional role of the US as a security guarantor? That's a critical question, right? Well, I'd suggest actually, regardless or counter to what some of the perceptions have been and the commentary has been on that there has not been a fundamental change, that the US does remain the only possible real security guarantor, the only one with the power projection capabilities to be able to play that role. If anything, in fact, it's been reinforced as a result of the GCC becoming irrelevant. For the smaller, both for Saudi Arabia, which realizes America remains an ineluctable source of protection, and for the smaller ones, who are now more worried than ever about Saudi Arabia, the US remains an absolutely central security guarantor. And in fact, if you look at the number of American troops in the region, in the Gulf, there's never been more than now. So, you know, it's always worth keeping that in mind when one thinks about these relative changes and the perceptions of people about chaos in the White House and perhaps diminishing US commitment to the Gulf and all of that. And you just have to listen to or look at how James Mattis and Rex Tillerson swung into action to contain the damage done by Trump with his initial few tweets after the Qatar boycott was imposed, to realize how important the Gulf does remain for these guys, for the state, the more enduring state institutions in the US, such as the State Department and Pentagon. Has it changed anything in terms of alliances? You know, another thing that's been suggested at times is, oh, well, now are there new alliances emerging? And is it a Qatar-Iran alliance, perhaps, which might be troublesome for some? Again, by and large, I'd say no. It remains true that these leaderships continue their policy, their dual policy of ensuring, of anchoring their security with a major hegemon, while at the same time developing these complementary relationships. That continues. In fact, both strands have been reinforced, I'd suggest. But alliance is quite a different thing, right? So Qatar-Iran, that's not an alliance, nor is it ever going to be an alliance. It's a pragmatic modus vivendi, right? Because it serves both sides' interests. They've been pushed into this inevitably by the boycott. It is not an alliance. One might say the Turkish-Qatari relationship is getting a little bit closer to an alliance, but I think the jury's out on that. Clearly, within what used to be the GCC, there is a very close, de facto, getting closer between Qatar, Oman, and Kuwait, largely because they share similar perspectives on some of these external threats. For instance, they all realize Iran, while problematic, has to be lived with and can be lived with. They realize that Islamism, or at least in its non-violent form, is not an existential threat and can be managed and can be lived with. And they all agree that Saudi Arabia is a significant threat. So their threat perceptions are similar, and they're kind of moving in the same kind of direction. What about other potential alliances that have been talked about? What about Saudi Arabia and Egypt? Well, I mean, their interests, or the interests of Sisi and Mohammed bin Salman, have temporarily coincided, economically, not least. I doubt very much that this is going to survive. Certainly not something that one can. And the whole idea about an alliance is it's enduring, right? I can't imagine Saudi Arabia and Egypt staying on the same page for very long. What about Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia? Of course, they're the two main instigators of a lot of stuff in the region, about the Qatar boycott, of the Yemen adventure, so on. I would suggest, in fact, there too, it's not really an alliance, it's an alliance of convenience. It's a cooperation, a marriage of convenience. Remember, not so long ago, there was major tension between Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi, leading to kilometers of trucks stuck at the border because of a dispute about where the central bank of a mooted Gulf currency union was going to be. There's been border issues between those two and so on. So there's been very serious tension between Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi in the past, and no doubt there will be in the future. If you look at what's been happening in Yemen, you see Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi have very divergent interests there, and their policies are at loggerheads, and often the people, their proxies on the ground have battled it out. It's been managed for the time being, but nevertheless. So in other words, I don't see that as I don't see any of these things as new alliances that have emerged out of the Qatar crisis. Okay, I suppose I should have said, no, let's move on. Let's move on. What about what does seem to me clear, and in fact I've already referred to a few times, is that for the longer term, not just now, for the longer term, Saudi Arabia has put pay to the whole idea that its dominance can be lived with for the sake of the Iranian threat, or for the sake of any other threat. And any idea that they were not interested in lording it over the little ones has been proven false, right? Certainly as far as the rulers in the other states are concerned. In fact, you might even go so far as to say that for many of these rulers of the smaller states, Saudi Arabia has become something of an existential threat, if you value your sovereignty. In fact, for Qatar, and arguably for some of the others, the Saudi threat now outweighs many other threats, or almost any other threats. That includes Kuwait, Oman, and of course Qatar, but also, I would argue, Dubai. So for Dubai, both Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia, I think, are seen as threats. For the rulers for the Al Maktoum. Okay, another long-term impact of the crisis is the societal fracture of the regional connectivity. There was real connectivity throughout the Gulf, the Khalij. And as I say, one of the successes of the GCC as an organization arguably had been precisely to inculcate in this whole generation of people who've been born and grown up since the GCC was created, of the Khaliji identity. That was always there in many ways before, but it's certainly been strengthened because of the possibility to travel, to invest, to live, and so on. So that all of that structure of possibility was grafted upon something that was already a regionally connected kinship network. So this has been fractured. The fact that families, wherever they are, as long as there's a Qatari connection, can no longer maintain this kind of connectivity. Travel to Kuwait to see their wife, their kids, and so on. So that kind of fracture, I think, is going to be long-term. The GCC as an organization, I said it right at the outset, I think has proven itself to be an empty shell in many ways. The GCC Secretary General was missing in action throughout this whole crisis, was completely invisible. There was not a single GCC statement. The notional arbitration mechanism that the GCC has for internal conflicts was never even talked about. It was completely out of the picture. And any of the aims that the GCC supposedly serves, of course, have been blown out of the water in terms of integration, as far as Qatar is concerned. And the same perceptions really very prevalent among Omanis and Kuwaitis. there is a reluctance to let it sink altogether because so much has been invested, even throughout societally and by people like Sheikh Sabah of Kuwait. But I think there's also a realization that it's certainly no longer the framework of reference if you want to secure your national and your regime's interests. So henceforth, all these states are going to pursue with ever more focus their own individual state and regime interests with reference, just as they used to do before the GCC existed. And the GCC is not really, except notionally, going to be a frame of reference. Let's see, what else should I say about this? I think I will leave it there. I've probably spent too much time already. And anything you want to throw at me or to make me have me explore further that I haven't talked about.
Thank you very much.